Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of With Flying Colors. I'm excited to be here today with Elizabeth Eurgubian. Elizabeth, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm going to give a little bit of your background. You can kind of fill in the blanks if I miss anything, but you're currently a partner at Atlas Advocacy. You and is in that role, you one of your clients is DCUC.
That's right.
And you, before that, you were the director of the Office of External Affairs and Communication and an advisor to the chair. I had to look at my notes on that because in my mind, that's PACA. It used to always be Public and Congressional Affairs. And even when I was there, they changed the name, but for me, it'll always be PACA.
Yeah.
Then before that, you were the Deputy Chief Advocacy Officer at CUNA. And before that, a VP at ICBA. So a lot of trade association work, and then you pivoted to working for a regulator, which I'm sure we'll get into here. But any steps along the way that you want to highlight there that I missed in your background?
Yeah. Well, I started out actually, went to law school, did that whole thing. I started out as an attorney at the Federal Reserve Board. So
Oh,
so I sometimes will compare the Fed to the NCUA on occasion because I did work there as well as an attorney on consumer financial services regulations. A lot of the stuff that I worked on there then moved over to the CFPB when that became an agency. And then after I worked at the Fed for about 4.5 years, I wanted some in-house experience, which, I wish more folks in DC on the policy side had. And I worked at Sallie Mae when they were, Fortune 400 company, and I helped with their private student loan products, the loan agreements, the marketing, the if there were problems with the APR, the operational issues, that sort of thing. So that was in my legal portfolio while I was there, and then because I loved advocacy so much, I did a little bit of that working at Sallie Mae, and I thought, "This is really fun." That's when I transitioned over to ICBA to work more so on the advocacy side.
okay, got it. And then you had the opportunity at CUNA, and then where we didn't pass, our crowds didn't pass because I had left NCUA by the time you came in. Uh,
Yeah,
and as I said, public and congressional affairs, the people who help get our message across is how I always viewed it as. But you were in charge of that for
that's right.
Chairman Harper, correct?
Yes, yes.
So walk through a little bit about your experience at NCUA in that role.
Sure, and it and that role, the Office of External Affairs and Communications, we call it OEAC. It was PACA before I was there. It pretty much oversees all of the lobbying for the agency, the relationships with members of Congress, because as you know, there's all these annual reports that the NCUA has to submit. Whenever members of Congress have questions on legislation that they're working on, like they need technical assistance, the OEAC office will oversee that process, and that's really important from a trade association standpoint because folks on the Hill don't understand credit unions. They don't understand the model like we think they do. And when NCUA can be very active in their communications with members and their staff to educate them on things, that is critical because it's very easy to get something wrong on the Hill, especially when things move fast. So that's another function of OEAC. Any kind of relationships with the members of Congress. Of course, the chairman usually testifies twice a year. We help them through that process. If there's ever other staff members that testify, which we did have a few others when I was there, we work with them through that process. And that's kind of like a show when someone's testifying before Congress. And we do, mooting sessions where we pretend we're members of Congress and ask them questions and make sure that they're really prepared for that because that's a pretty intimidating process to go through. In addition, we work a lot on the interagency communications with other agencies, FDIC, OCC, Federal Reserve. There's a lot of interagency efforts through the FFIC and the Financial Stability Oversight Council. I was Chairman Harper's plus one at some of those FSOC meetings. And we do the external affairs. So, if a league comes to town, who's organizing, who's going to talk to that? That goes through the OEAC office as well. If there's other meetings that we think the chairman should be at, our chair should be at, we sort of work their calendar and make sure they're present at certain functions throughout the country, as well as other members, other staff members at NCUA and all the comms. So you're talking, anything that goes external, any type of communication that goes to the outside world goes through OIAC. And actually, OIAC ran a lot of internal comms as well. But really, the letters to credit unions, we would, look at those, all the press releases, all of the messages that folks get by email. All of that went through OIAC, as well as when I was there, the website. I think that's since moved to another department. But when I was there, we really focused on the website, did a lot of work on that, and social media, making sure we communicated very regularly with the industry via social media. So it was a huge portfolio to have, a very important office. I'll also highlight for folks that don't know, the OEAC office is the only office in the NCUA that is somewhat political, in that the director and the assistant director, when I was there, were political appointees. And that's typically the way it works. So we only report to the chairman and the chairman's chief of staff. We don't report to, what your position was, Larry Fazio, when he was there. Larry, we had meetings with them. We don't report to him, though. We report to the chair, and we only report to the chair. Again, we don't report to the full board. So we could, interact with the other board members and help them with things here and there. But OEAC served the chair.
Yeah, it's a very unique position that 98% of the people at NCUA don't actually understand how it's different, let alone the credit union world. And I might get part of this wrong, but so with 3 board members, each of them have 2 Schedule C appointees for their
Right.
chief of staff and their office assistant, executive assistant. So that's 6. And then there were 2 or 3 others that were additional Schedule Cs that were the purview of the chair, right? Like you said, they report to the chair. So the other board members could interact with you, but again, your supervisor was the chair. And then when there's a change in chair, those positions move with the new chair, right? And then typically what happens is if it goes from D to R in particular, there's a change in those positions, and they bring someone in that they either knew or want to get into to consistent with what their beliefs might be. Anything to add to kind of what I said there?
No, I think that's maybe a couple things. Like, yeah, whereas Chairman Harper had his 2 folks that worked within the board office, those folks would technically, they would go with him if he stayed and moved to become a board member under a
Right.
new administration. But the OEAC folks, they go. The top 2, or they say goodbye to everybody and have a nice, cake and go on their way. Because, like you said, those are political appointees, and the new chair is going to come in and they're going to want somebody with their vision to run that office. And the other point about that, the reason behind that too, is because if you look at the statute, Federal Credit Union Act, the chair is the spokesperson
Exactly.
for the agency. So OEAC serves that function of helping the chair become the spokesperson. And that's with Congress, that's with in interagency communications. The chairman could go to or chair could go to an FSOC meeting and represent a position for NCUA that the other 2 board members don't agree with at all. And they're
Correct.
perfectly within their statutory authority to do that, as well as testifying. They could testify saying, this is what we'd like the agency to work on, and talk about all these things that the other 2 board members are thinking, well, I don't necessarily agree with that. And that's the way it is because of the function of the chair as the spokesperson for the agency.
Sure. And as you're describing your role there, and of course, Todd was the director of PACA, which is now OEAC. And I think back to one time in my career, I was in the Western region, new director of special actions. And my boss was the previous director of special actions. And the other ARD used to be considered himself to be the best director of special actions ever to walk the earth. And the regional director also had been a director of special actions. So I had 3 bosses that previously thought they were the best at doing the job I had. And so the unique flavor of that is, and I'll give you my perspective. Todd is a really good writer. He wants everything to be written extremely well, wants the communication to be extremely strong, and built that up a little bit, built the program up when he was there as the director. And then I think did even more of that as the chair. So you walked into filling a role, serving a chair who used to have that role, which is a unique, it's a unique opportunity, but also creates, some synergies, but also some challenges.
Yes, absolutely. It is difficult in regard because they're going to be looking at the position with a different eye that maybe somebody else would and be like, well, gee, I did it this way. How come you don't?
Exactly. Yeah.
So
They have context that other typical board members wouldn't.
absolutely. I could say I loved working for Todd Harper. He is just a joy to work with. I loved working with Catherine Delicia, the chief of staff, extremely intelligent person. And it was, I learned so much from both of them. And there were times, it does raise certain issues because there's certain things I think are extremely important. And there's certain things that, maybe Todd thought were extremely important. And most of the time we were in alignment, I think. But every now and then there might have been the time that we weren't. And my job is to do what the chair wants.
Sure.
And so that's what I would do. And even times I'd be reminded, well, that's a good idea, Elizabeth, but you're not the chair.
Yes.
So, but I gotta respect Todd and Catherine both in that they really did seek my guidance a lot and respected it. And even when we didn't agree, they always asked for it. And I can say I've not had that in other positions where, you know, my opinion and my thoughts on something were valued so highly. Just to have that perspective, even if you didn't maybe go my direction or what you wanted to, they always wanted my perspective. So that's the sign of great leadership, I think.
Sure.
And, I commend them for that. But yeah, it's always difficult when someone comes in and you used to do that job.
Yeah, yeah. It's a like you said, it's an opportunity to learn more because they know some things, And I think of my time with Todd educated me one time because, as you know, I came from Sarbanes' office, Senator Sarbanes, and he used to tell, we'd talk about, what's the chances of this happening, taxation or different things before Congress, and he'd say, when he started helping Sarbanes and he needed to get a vote through, they'd have the left, the right, and those in the middle. And it was those in the middle that would decide how you get a bill through. And that over time, while he was doing that, those in the middle, the moving parts to get a vote done were less and less each year. And now you can extrapolate that today. There's maybe one or two on each side that might be swing votes. But Todd came from a very collaborative role in Senate. And I get the sense, and he did that when I saw him as a board member.
Absolutely.
And I get the sense, and like you say, that the chair can be collaborative or not, right? They can say, PACA works for me. The letters to credit union can come from me. I'm the chair. And there were board members that I've dealt with who would just issue the letter and the other board members would see the letter would come out the same time staff and credit unions would. And I know just from the way I've seen what has come in some letters while he was chair, that he was collaborative like he was in Congress. Any takes on
Yeah.
that?
I can give insight like that. So these are times actually too where my vision might not align with Todd's, because there were times I thought Todd was collaborative when I didn't think he should be. He didn't need to be. You know what I mean? So that shows you how collaborative he is. I mean, especially when the majority was on the Democratic side. The last year he was chair, he didn't necessarily need to be as collaborative as he was, and he was. And there were times I sat back and was like, why are we taking the time to make sure, we have these conversations, just get this thing through. Who cares if someone's unhappy with it or not? You have the votes. And then I realized later why that was such a smart approach that he took with making sure everyone had investment in the decision. Because as you see now, when you have regulatory issues that swing back and forth, if you're invested initially in decision making on policy, even when you don't have to be, when things swing to the other side of the policy of the aisle or whatever you want to call it, when they swing to the other side, there's less likelihood that policies will be changed because all members were invested in the policy initially. I know I'm
Sure.
saying this in a strange.
No, that you said that very well.
So Todd was many times playing chess, and I was playing checkers. Well, I really, and when I saw how that played out later, I thought, okay,
That's what he
I
was doing.
see, I see.
And he's just naturally collaborative, but it's a good way, or organizationally and organically, to get buy-in.
Yes, and right, because buy-in isn't just about the vote. I guess it's a longer way of saying buy-in isn't just about the vote. It's about the investment, because you're not going to destroy something you were initially invested in.
Right? Yeah, very well said. And going back to a couple things what we used to call them were murder boards, right? When you prepare a board member, you might have been involved in prepping OTSCA to get confirmed, and staff sits out there and asks the hard questions. The goal being, we're going to ask you harder questions than Congress does, but what they could ask you if they decide to get feisty, right? So that
Right.
if those come up, you're ready. That was to me was a fascinating process and fun process to be involved in, and I actually do sometimes. I took the murder board concept and I'll have credit union clients where I'm helping them saying, okay, well, if NCUA, let's walk through what NCUA might say to you relative to these issues on your exam. What's your answer going to be? No, that's not a good answer. You need to get you need to work on that. But any comments or thoughts on that murder board process?
Yeah, in fact, I think that's a great approach to take with your clients, to kind of take what you got from the murder boarding. Todd did not like the term murder boarding, so we tried to try to find out another term. I don't know. That's the only term I know.
Right.
It's mooting. I don't know. I mean, but it actually was one of my favorite things that I did at the NCUA. I mean, it was stressful to prepare for these hearings, but it's kind of like running a race. You hate preparing for it, but after the race is done, you think, God, that was great. I kind of want to do it again. That's what I felt like the hearings were. And of course, we had great people to work with in that. Todd and some of the others, some of the NCUA staff members who had never done this before and had to testify at hearings did an excellent job. Of course, Tanya, one of the best I've seen in terms of preparation for this sort of thing. Of course, she worked in the Senate. She had some
Sure.
perspective there. But it is very interesting because you do want to prepare them as much as possible in getting really tough questions, especially when it's the chairman or the chair testifying. So yeah, we would have to, we want him prepared as much as we could. And sometimes it's uncomfortable to have to ask your boss these questions that are really aggressive and have to do it in an aggressive way. And also the way you ask the question, because you don't just always ask the question and then wait for their answer. You interrupt them, you're rude, you ask a 5-part question that they don't even know where to begin with. And they kind of have to be a good sport about it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's fun. I actually brought one of the mooting sessions we did with Todd. I brought my sons in. They had it was like they were off for the
Oh,
night.
cool.
So I brought 2 of my kids in to watch it, and Todd was nice enough to let them sit in the back and watch this. And, afterwards they told me he did a really good job. I'm like, oh, I'm glad you think that. But just preparing for that is a lot of work. You have to have a binder of all of the things that the chair or whoever's testifying has to know about and has to absorb. They have to know who all of the members are, things about the members, to have some perspective into the questions they're going to ask. What the members that, on the committee, what legislation they've supported and not supported. All of this has to be absorbed. And any question could come up. I remember working for CUNA, and I think it was the nicest lady ever, Martha Ninachek, testifying. And I had them place a Cecil question, because the trades are placing.
They drop questions, right?
And I'm like, Martha's not gonna she doesn't work on Cecil, but we wanted that point raised in the hearing. We wanted airtime on Cecil at the time. So I asked for this question, and you got to prepare the folks to get these questions that have nothing to do with their portfolio, or they don't have the answer at the time, and prepare them to provide an answer that says, I'm going to have to get back to you on that when I talk to my,
Right.
my. So all of these scenarios you have to prepare them for, and then in addition, you got to do your intelligence, where you find out what members are going to ask what, because sometimes they'll leak those questions to you ahead of time.
Right.
And sometimes the trades will leak them to you. You go to the trades, hey, what questions are you planting? And if you have good relationships there, they'll say, okay, Elizabeth, I'll tell you, we're going to plant these 5. And you could prepare the chair, whoever's testifying, for, to have a good answer for those questions. Now, this goes to the overall point that the number one most important thing, if you're a lobbyist, a trade association person, or you work for OEAC, is the relationships you have with people.
Right.
You don't have to like them personally. Who cares? You got to have as many good relationships as humanly possible with everybody, because there's always going to be time you're going to need to ask them, hey, can you give me those questions? Hey, can there something I can do for you? So you're always making friends. You're always helping people out. If they need something for you, you give it to them. because you want to establish that capital there because
Goodwill. You got to have that goodwill because you might need it. Yep.
Yep, and you're gonna have to call in a favor sometime. There are so many folks I've met that I'm like, God, I don't like that person. But I'm like, later I had to call in a favor from them. So me not liking them, I don't have the privilege of not liking them. I gotta like everybody.
It's a lot like being executive director.
Yes.
So, as we're talking about all these things that the office did, and you and I recently chatted online a little bit about NCUA's budget, right? So the Trump administration put the hiring freeze in, asked for agencies to come up with reorganizations. NCUA came up with a plan that was prolifically successful in getting people to take the opportunities to leave, right? And
Right.
different offices are impacted differently, but it looks like OEAC got hit pretty hard in the budget as far as the number of FTEs that were there and the number of FTEs that are still in the budget. And the challenge NCUA has right now is if people did leave, there's still a hiring freeze, right? So in their budget, they're going to have their budget briefing, and then they're going to have their final budget. They've built in some flex. I don't know if it's 20 or 25 positions where they're saying we'll add some positions back as needed in 2026 when the freeze comes off. But I think OEAC was down to like 3 people, which was probably in the top 2 or 3 offices. That's going to be a challenge to do all those things that the examiners are going to be challenged. E&I is going to be challenged. GC is going to be challenged, but putting the agency's best foot forward when new board members come in, getting them doing the murder boards to get them on board. If something happens where there's legislation, fighting taxation, whatever, three, some might argue that the number it was at was more than needed. You could argue that in any office, but I think everybody would argue that 3 is probably not enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not one of these offices you would intuitively, say, oh, this has to have a lot of folks, because a lot of, like you said, even within NCUA, even within the folks that work there, a lot of people didn't understand what OEAC did because it's kind of in a bubble in terms of it only reports to the one member. It does everything for the chair, and everything it does is outside of the agency. So maybe not everybody within NCUA is seeing the type of workload there is. Yeah, we had 16 people. I would have had to do a good job, 26 people, because I wanted to do good work. And that comes from my time working for trade associations. So ironically, when you have folks saying, well, we want a lean budget, and I agree with that. You want to make sure things are streamlined and efficient because credit unions are ultimately paying for all of this, and you have to be very sensitive to that. You also want to put your best foot forward as an agency, like you said, and with externally how the agency looks, having a staff of 3, that's going to be very difficult. So that's one place where I saw that and I flagged and thought, oh man, that's going to be tough because there's just so much that office does. We were understaffed where I was there, that it's just going to be really a challenge. And I want credit unions to sort of think about that, because if your agency doesn't represent itself well in interagency meetings with the others, when you have some of these interagency rulemakings that come down, like with Genius Act, you don't want credit unions to get the shaft when those things are put together. You want to make sure you have the brain power and the representation in those meetings and the right people in those meetings, and enough of them that they could absorb the workload. Working at the Fed and dealing with the NCUA, we used to kind of joke about the Fed that the NCUA did not have the teams working on these interagency rulemakings that the rest of us, like, we'd have 10 people working on an interagency rulemaking. They'd have the same one person working on it. And one person could only do so much. And that means that the credit union voice and the model and the difference isn't going to be as represented in those meetings as it should be. And that only hurts credit unions. All of these things need to think about. Like Todd, you got to play chess, you can't play checkers. So where are you going to put the investment? You got to put the investment in some of these other offices like OEAC, even though it has nothing to do with examinations. It's how the agency is putting its face forward when dealing with all these outside entities, members of Congress. They could write legislation that they don't realize harms credit unions. How many bills have talked about the deposit fund and didn't mention the share insurance fund? We had to go back and say, you got to mention the share insurance fund too. or they would talk about, they'd use a definition of financial institution that didn't include credit unions because the NCUA wasn't at the table to tell
Right.
them, hey, you've got to put this other statutory definition that has credit unions included. If you don't have the people to do that, mistakes get made and credit unions get left out of critical policies and things that could really help them innovate and develop. And I can't tell you how many times that's happened. So when I see these numbers, that concerns me.
No, great, very well said. When I was the executive director, and we would get ready, would prep the CFO, and I would prep the board for the budget briefings and the budget approval, and the trades would come in and say, "There's less credit unions. Your budget's gone up, and it shouldn't." And then so I would say, "Credit unions are more complicated. There's more assets, and we have to educate our staff, and we need to do this, and then we get these other things that come in from elsewhere, et cetera, et cetera." So there was always this balance, but I would look at, if you, a stat I remember was the training that credit unions do for their own boards and the travel that they do, whatever percentage that was compared to their assets or their gross income, was roughly equivalent to the cost of the exam program. If you took the NCUA program and the state program and had the same denominator compared to those other costs, it's like, you're training your staff, you're doing travel to go do that training. That's what your exam costs, even though it's grown. And to me, your spot is perfectly spot on. If NCUA doesn't have staff at the table to say what credit unions' interests are or what the agency's interest is, things can change, like law and sausage, right? They happen at midnight, and if nobody was there to talk about it because we saved one or two FTEs for a year and a half, that could be cataclysmic.
Absolutely. And now some might come back and say, well, that's what the trade associations are for. We can do that and we have the resources to do that. But here's the thing. NCUA is the credible agency. You know what I mean?
Right, right.
More the government. There's a credibility that comes with, I mean, I work for trade associations. I love them, whatever. But there's a credibility that comes from having that government regulator saying, no, this is how this would actually play out, and having that consultation that is different than just getting it from a lobbyist.
Sure, yeah, and even like when you say that, I think of Treasury, right? When NCUA would say our position on the CLF is the powers need to be expanded, and then Treasury would say we agree with NCUA, we would be dancing, going, "We have Treasury on our side," right? Because of their credibility, and the same that you could stack the different regulators relative to credibility, but NCUA is nimble, is well respected. They're not Treasury, but there is a respect that the Senate gives consideration. But if you're not at the table, or you're too busy doing X because you can't do Y, bad things can happen as a result of that.
That's absolutely right.
The trades, time at NCUA, time at the Fed, and then the trade association side. Was there one or two things you learned about NCUA and the government side? I mean, you'd obviously been at the Fed before, but compare and contrast. What do the trades need to know about NCUA, and then what does NCUA need to know about the trades? Putting both your hats on.
I would say what the trade should know about NCUA is that their letters, the comment letters, really do make a difference. I think, when you write to the CFPB and they get thousands of letters, it's easy to feel like, I don't even know if this is going to, make an impact here. But the NCUA doesn't get thousands of letters. Sometimes we got 10 comment letters on something, sometimes 35. We didn't get the huge numbers on issues once, and very, very rarely. And even then, the staff looked at all the letters, and I know Todd read all the letters. So I think that it's really, I think the meetings are important. They're great to have the hike the hill and meet the members and meet the staff and the board and to engage that way. But I think the comment letters are very important, and as much effort even on the individual credit union side is important. And I think credit unions think, well, I only have one issue here. I can't like dissect this whole FR notice. And I would say to them, just write your one issue. Say this issue stood out to us. We defer to the trade associations on everything else. But really, this is the one that we want to point out to you and the impact it has on our credit union so that you know when you go into the final rulemaking. I think that's a really influential way to make your mark and to show what policies will work best for the industry and to really influence the board. The second I would say is follow up. I don't know if you had this experience, but when you work for the NCUA, when you work for the board, you meet with so many entities. And I think sometimes that, you have these hike the hills and you have these coalitions of credit unions that come in, they really prepare for these meetings. And, the chairman's there, I'm there, other folks are there. And we listen to this wonderfully prepared, articulate meeting with all of these points that are so interesting and thought provoking. And we're thinking, yeah, this is great. And then I get up to walk back to my office after that meeting, and I've literally forgotten the entire meeting on the walk from there to my office because there's so many meetings I go to.
Sure,
And I'm
sure.
sure it's the same for others. So I tell folks the meeting is just the taste, it's just the appetizer. Don't think you come in for this meeting, you show this, you have your position, and then you're done. No, you're never done as a lobbyist. You're done when you're dead, when you're a lobbyist. So follow up.
That's
Have a
great
reason.
advice.
Yeah, have a reason to write back and say, maybe have them ask a question, say, "Oh, we'll get back to you." Now you have an excuse to follow up. "Oh, per your question, we looked into that," and blah, blah, blah. You could follow up with emails, follow up with letters. That's just the first taste. The rest of the meal has to come later. So don't let that be a one and done because then it's just worthless. All that time you put into that meeting, you could have put it into something else.
Great.
So that's my advice for training.
That's fabulous. And so thinking about that, NAFCU, CUNA are now America's credit unions. I'm a big believer in the wisdom of crowds, right? One of the things you heard about those two groups merging is that's one less letter that goes into Congress, that goes into NCUA.
Yeah.
But, I've kind of seen, I think DCUC has kind of stepped their game up, right? Saying, hey, there's only one other huge voice. DCUC is getting bigger and gaining momentum and putting more energy into commenting on everything, coming up with ideas as it relates to military related credit unions, etc. I think that's important. I know you work with them in some ways, but then you're also doing your own work as part of the Atlas Advocacy. Let's talk a little bit about that and or what you're doing post NCUA.
Yeah, so I'm taking all the experience I learned from my agency side, the Fed side, the trade association, and then also working in house and understanding how regulations actually play out when you have products and services, and representing clients. Anything on the regulatory side, I'm happy to work with. I have some limitations on meeting with NCUA folks until for another few months. And then once that limitation goes away, I could, have more engagement with that agency. But I've done a lot of engagements with other agencies and also speaking about what it was like to work at the NCUA and what I think credit unions should sort of focus on, particularly on the advocacy side, what expectations I see in the coming years. And then talking a lot about cybersecurity, because that was one thing I learned at the NCUA that is such a significant issue that we don't have the grasp on it that we all should. And we're fine today, but once a breach happens, they could be absolutely catastrophic. So I'm trying to communicate some of the lessons that I learned with the NCUA to the industry, and I've been doing that. And then of course, DCUC is one client that I have. They're just a fabulous client because they really care about these issues. They want to get it right, and they do bring a lot of interesting ideas on the regulatory side that can help policymakers, and they just engage with everybody so well. So it's been a pleasure working with them as well as some of the other leagues that I've worked with as well. On the agency side, I think, like I had said, I know you had asked before, what do the agencies need to learn about the industry? And I wish more folks that worked in government had worked for a company at one point or worked for a credit union or a bank or something at one point, because how policies actually work in the everyday is not always what you think when you're writing them. So as much of concrete examples that they could learn from the industry, and the industry has to, communicate that to them. I think as much of that as possible, because even as a consultant, I have to constantly talk with credit unions and with financial institutions on what they're facing because I'm not in it every day anymore. So I'm not seeing those issues, but I know the right questions to ask because I used to be in that position.
Sure.
And I think agencies should probably have a little bit more of the industry folks there so they know the right questions to ask, because that's the key to really understanding what issues might be present with certain policymakers.
Yeah, yeah. The unintended consequences of a policy that NCUA might think is perfect, that meets all the needs of the three board members and meets the needs of the Federal Credit Union Act and takes into consideration what the trade said. Then it gets out there
Yep,
the credit unions themselves go, wait, you didn't think about X, right? So
that's
I
exactly
see
right.
that in some of the consulting that I've learned a lot about that, I'll say, since I left NC
That's
to the real world. So Elizabeth, if this has been great, if a listener or a watcher would like to reach out to you and touch base with you about anything that you've chatted with about here, what's the best way for them to reach you?
My email, Elizabeth.Eurgubian, Eurgubian at atlasadvocacy.com. It's a great way to reach me. Email me anytime. You could also reach me on LinkedIn. I'm always checking my LinkedIn. And lots of clients have reached me through that, just emailing me on LinkedIn. So those are the best ways to reach me. Atlasadvocacy.com is our website. I do a lot of speaking to boards just on my perspective and also consultation with credit unions. So that's a good way to get in touch with me. I'm happy to chat with anybody.
Fantastic. And I'll put those in the show notes. And Elizabeth, I want to thank you for your time today. This has been a lot of fun catching up with you and about NCUA.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You got it. And listeners, I want to thank you for listening and or watching. I hope you'll listen again soon. This is Mark Treichel signing off with Flying Colors.